On the evening of December 3rd, 1926, Agatha Christie ate dinner with her husband Archibald at their home in Sunningdale, Berkshire. There was nothing recorded about the meal, no argument that neighbors overheard, no letter written beforehand to a friend. After dinner, she put their 7-year-old daughter Rosalind to bed. Then sometime after 11 o'clock, she got into her Morris Cowley motor car and drove away from the house. The car was found the next morning, half embedded in a chalk bank at Newlands Corner in Surrey. The headlights were still on. Her fur coat was inside. A suitcase was in the back. Agatha Christie was gone. She would not be found for 11 days. When she was registered at a hotel in Harrogate, Yorkshire, under the name Teresa Neal, the surname of the woman her husband was having an affair with. She appeared to have no memory of how she had arrived there. She told police very little. She told the press nothing at all. And in the decades that followed, through a second marriage, a celebrated career, worldwide fame, and a quiet death in 1976, she never once publicly explained what had happened that night. That silence is where this story lives, not in the mystery itself, but in everything that made the disappearance possible, in the years of accumulated pressure that preceded it, and the years of careful reconstruction that followed. What happened at Newlands Corner was not a beginning. It was the moment a long, private unraveling finally became visible to the world. Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller was born on September 15, 1890, in Torquay, Devon, into a household that was comfortable without being extraordinary. Her father, Frederick Miller, was an American of modest inherited income, charming, sociable, and largely unnecessary to the running of the family. Her mother, Clara, was the kind of woman who generated atmosphere. She had strong opinions about education, about intuition, about the invisible architecture of the inner life. She believed, among other things, that children should not be taught to read too early, that the mind needed to develop in its own sequence, without interference. Agatha learned to read at 4, by herself, from her sister's discarded primers. She told no one for some time. This small private act, acquiring something alone, quietly, without asking permission or seeking praise, established a pattern that would persist for the rest of her life. Not secrecy exactly, something more like self-containment, a habit of developing interior resources before the exterior world had any chance to weigh in on them. The household in Torquay, called Ashfield, was large enough for a child to disappear into. There was a garden with a beech tree that Agatha climbed regularly. There were long afternoons with no structured occupation. Her brother Monty was 11 years older and largely absent. Her sister Madge was 10 years older and away at school for much of Agatha's early childhood. What this meant, in practice, was that Agatha spent a significant portion of her formative years in the company of adults, servants, and her own imagination. She invented companions, not in the distressed way of a lonely child seeking substitutes, but with the deliberate creative pleasure of someone who found invented company more controllable than real company. There was a group she called the Kittens. Later, a more elaborate cast of characters she called the Girls, who had names, personalities, and ongoing storylines she returned to over months. She was the author of their lives before she had any framework for what authorship meant. Her father died in 1901 when Agatha was 11. Frederick Miller had been ill for some time, a series of vague, worsening complaints that the family discussed in lowered voices. His death was not sudden, but it was nonetheless destabilizing. He had been, in the particular economy of their household, the social center. He liked people, brought them home, generated warmth through sheer willingness. Without him, Ashfield contracted. Clara withdrew into a sustained, quiet grief that lasted years. The servants remained. The garden remained. Agatha moved through both with the careful self-sufficiency she had already been practicing. What did not remain was any formal structure to her education. Clara had already been overseeing it herself with idiosyncratic commitment. After Frederick's death, this continued, but with the additional weight of Clara's fluctuating health and attention. There were piano lessons in Paris at 15, sometime at a finishing school. But there was no sustained intellectual framework, no examination system, no peer group against which Agatha measured herself academically. She read voraciously and without direction. She wrote stories that she showed almost no one. This was not understood as a problem. In the Edwardian upper-middle-class household in which Agatha was being raised, the education of daughters was oriented toward a specific endpoint, a suitable marriage. Reading was acceptable. Musical accomplishment was desirable. Independent intellectual ambition was not a category that required attention. Agatha was pleasant, imaginative, moderately pretty, and well-mannered. There was nothing to worry about. That absence of worry is itself worth noting. It meant that the considerable interior life developing inside this quiet, self-contained girl went almost entirely unobserved. Clara noticed things. She was perceptive in the way she was perceptive about most things, intuitively but unsystematically. But there was no one in Agatha's childhood who was consistently paying close attention to what she was actually thinking. She was not a child who demanded attention. She was not a child who caused problems. She was, by all external measures, perfectly fine. The debutante season came in 1906. Agatha was presented, attended the required events, wore the required clothes. She found it largely bewildering, not distressing. She was observant enough to find people interesting as material, but genuinely foreign to whatever instincts she had developed in those long, solitary afternoons at Ashfield. The social performance required of a young woman on the marriage market demanded a specific kind of outward legibility. You were meant to be readable, appealing, available for interpretation. Agatha had spent her entire childhood becoming very deliberately the opposite of readable. She had several suitors during this period. She handled them with a politeness that apparently left most of them uncertain whether they were being encouraged or gently refused. There is a quality in her accounts of these years, written much later in an autobiography that is itself a masterwork of selective disclosure, of someone watching herself move through social rituals that felt designed for a person slightly different from who she actually was. Clara's health became a more pressing concern around 1909 and 1910. There were heart problems, and doctors recommended she spend time in warmer climates. Agatha accompanied her to Egypt and to France, the dutiful unmarried daughter performing the role that unmarried daughters of that class and era were expected to perform. She attended dinner parties in Cairo. She danced. She observed. She wrote almost nothing during this period, or nothing that survived, and it would be easy to read these years as dormant, a pause before the real story begins. But something was accumulating: the observations, the capacity for stillness, the practiced ability to inhabit a social situation fully while remaining, in some essential way, elsewhere. These were not qualities that made Agatha unhappy. They were simply qualities that made her difficult to know. When she returned to England and met Archibald Christie at a dance in October 1912, she was 22 years old. She had been writing seriously for at least 3 years, though she had not published anything. She had a completed novel manuscript that had already been rejected. She had a rich, detailed interior life and almost no reliable outlet for it. Archie Christie was 23, a lieutenant in the Royal Field Artillery, and physically striking in a way that Agatha later described with an admiration that reads, even decades later, as slightly helpless. He was confident in the uncomplicated way of young men who have not yet been seriously contradicted by life. He was not particularly interested in books. She found him enormously attractive. Archibald Christie was not, by any careful measure, an obvious match for Agatha Miller. This was visible to people around them almost immediately. He was charming in the way that certain men of his generation and class were charming, through physical confidence, easy humor, and a complete absence of self-doubt. He moved through social situations without the private commentary that Agatha brought to everything. He did not analyze. He did not observe with any particular curiosity. He experienced. Agatha, watching him across rooms, found this quality magnetic in a way she could not entirely explain and did not entirely examine. Their courtship between 1912 and 1914 was conducted largely through letters and brief supervised meetings. Archie was stationed at various posts, increasingly consumed by the military buildup that preceded the war. Agatha was at Ashfield, accompanying Clara, writing in the hours she could extract from domestic obligation. The letters she kept from this period reveal a woman working very hard to hold the attention of someone whose attention was not naturally inclined towards sustained focus on other people. She was funny in the letters. self-deprecating, alert to his moods in a way that suggested she was already calibrating herself to him. He proposed twice before she accepted. The first time, she declined. The engagement felt rushed, uncertain, insufficiently grounded. Clara had reservations she expressed quietly and consistently. There was something in Archie, Clara appeared to sense, that would not soften with time. Agatha heard these reservations, acknowledged them, and set them aside. The second proposal came in 1914, weeks after war was declared. Archie was about to deploy to France with the Royal Flying Corps. The urgency of the moment, the particular romantic pressure of a young man about to go to war, reconfigured the calculation. They became engaged and married on Christmas Eve 1914 in a ceremony arranged with very little time and very little ceremony. Clara did not attend. She was unwell. Whether the illness was physical or whether it was Clara's method of registering her continued misgiving was something Agatha did not address publicly. What followed was not a honeymoon in any conventional sense. Archie returned to France almost immediately after the wedding. Agatha took up voluntary work at the Torquay Town Hall dispensary, eventually training as an apothecary's assistant. This work, measuring, compounding, learning the precise properties of substances that could heal or kill in calibrated doses, would eventually furnish the technical infrastructure of her fiction. But in 1915 it was simply occupation, something to do while waiting. She finished her first published novel during this period. The mysterious affair at Styles had been begun before the war, suggested partly by a challenge from her sister Madge, who doubted Agatha could construct a genuinely puzzling detective story. The novel was rejected by multiple publishers before finally being accepted by John Lane at the Bodley Head in 1919. The terms of the contract were poor. Agatha retained almost no rights, and the royalty structure heavily favored the publisher. She signed without significant negotiation. She was simply grateful it would exist. Archie came home from France in 1918, altered in the specific way that the war altered men who had flown over it. He had been decorated. He had survived things that others had not. He came back with a determined cheerfulness that functioned as a wall. There were things he would not discuss. There were moods that descended without explanation and lifted without explanation. Agatha, who had spent the war years in a sustained state of private anxiety about his survival, received him back with relief so intense it may have prevented her from looking carefully at what she was actually receiving. They settled first in London, in a flat in St. John's Wood that was too small and too expensive. Archie had joined a financial firm in the city and was working aggressively toward a prosperity that felt always slightly ahead of where they actually were. Money was a persistent, low-grade pressure. Styles was published in 1920 and earned Agatha £25. She began a second novel. Their daughter Rosalind was born in August 1919. The birth was difficult. Agatha recovered slowly. Archie, by her own later account, found the domestic reorganization that a new baby required. The noise, the disruption, the shift in his wife's available attention, genuinely uncomfortable. He was not indifferent to Rosalind in any dramatic way. He simply did not expand to accommodate her. The household reorganized itself around this fact, as households do, with Agatha absorbing the adjustment and Archie continuing largely as before. This was not unusual for men of his class and generation. It was the expected shape of a marriage. Agatha understood this and operated within it. But understanding a structure and being nourished by it are different things. And in the letters and accounts from this period, there is a detectable quality of a woman doing a great deal of invisible work. Emotional, domestic, logistical, while the person she was doing it alongside remained essentially unaware that work was being performed. Archie liked golf. This is a small fact that carries more weight than it appears to. Golf for Archie Christie was not a hobby. It was a vocation. It consumed his weekends entirely, generated his closest friendships, and provided the social world he actually inhabited and cared about. Agatha did not play golf. She was invited occasionally to the periphery of this world, the clubhouse lunches, the social events adjacent to the course, and attended with the practiced pleasantness she had been deploying since the debutante years. But she was peripheral to the thing Archie loved most, and they both knew it. She published 4 more novels between 1920 and 1925. Each one sold better than the last. Her name was becoming recognizable in ways that Archie acknowledged politely and did not particularly engage with. When people at dinner parties addressed questions to her about her books, he would sometimes redirect the conversation, not aggressively, with the easy social fluency of someone who simply found other topics more interesting. Agatha noticed. She wrote it down nowhere that has survived. But, she noticed, the marriage was not unhappy in any visible or dramatic way during these years. It was something quieter and in some ways harder to name. A state of managed distance between two people occupying the same house, in which one person was paying close attention and the other had decided, without ever quite deciding, that close attention was unnecessary. The years between 1920 and 1924 had a surface appearance of forward motion. Archie was advancing at his firm. The novels were selling. Rosalind was growing into a self-possessed, watchful child, who resembled her father in temperament more than her mother. Contained, not easily read, uncomfortable with sentiment. The family moved from the St. John's Wood flat to a house in Sunningdale, Berkshire, which placed them closer to the golf club Archie preferred and further from the London literary world that was beginning cautiously to take notice of Agatha's work. The move was framed as practical. More space, better air, a garden. These were the stated reasons, and they were not false. But the effect of the move was to embed Agatha more firmly in Archie's social geography and more distantly from her own. The neighbors in Sunningdale were largely connected to finance and sport. Conversation at dinner parties ran toward the market, the course, and the kind of cheerful political conservatism that required no examination. Agatha listened, contributed when expected, and returned home having said almost nothing. She actually thought. She was writing The Murder of Roger Ackroyd during this period. It would be published in 1926 and would become eventually one of the most discussed detective novels in the English language. Its structural conceit so unexpected that it generated genuine controversy among readers and critics who felt, variously, that it was a work of genius or a profound violation of the genre's implicit contract. Agatha constructed it quietly, in the hours available to her, in a household that was not organized around the idea that her work required protection. There was no study designated as hers. She wrote at the dining room table or in whatever room happened to be empty. Archie did not disturb her intentionally. He simply moved through the house with the unthinking ease of someone who had never had to negotiate for space, and the cumulative effect of his presence, the golf talk, the friends who came for weekends, the domestic machinery that required her oversight, was a persistent low-level interference that Agatha absorbed without complaint and without, apparently, fully registering as a problem. Clara's health had been declining since the early 1920s. The heart difficulties that had required the warmer climate travel years before had not resolved. She was living at Ashfield, increasingly dependent on care, and Agatha traveled to Torquay regularly to manage the household and sit with her mother through the deteriorations. These visits were not discussed much in the social world Agatha and Archie inhabited. They were simply part of the invisible load, the category of obligation that fell to women without being named or acknowledged as labor. Archie did not accompany her on these visits. He found illness, by Agatha's later account, genuinely difficult to be near. Not from cruelty, there is no evidence of deliberate coldness, but from a constitutional aversion to situations he could not manage or exit. The war had produced this in many men, or deepened something already present. Archie's response to anything that could not be fixed or dismissed was to remove himself from its vicinity. Agatha registered this. She managed Clara's decline largely alone. It was during one of these visits to Torquay in early 1924 that Agatha met a woman named Nancy Neal for the first time, though she did not know the significance of the meeting at the time. Nancy was young, sociable, and moved easily through exactly the kind of golf and finance social world that Archie inhabited and Agatha had never fully entered. She was not literary. She was not interested in detection or narrative or the precise properties of alkaloids. She laughed easily and without the slight delay that characterized Agatha's own humor, which required an audience willing to wait for it. Archie had begun playing golf with Nancy's circle sometime in 1923. The precise timing of when this became something other than golf has never been definitively established. What is documented is that by 1925, Archie was spending increasing amounts of time with Nancy Neal, and decreasing amounts of time accounting for where he had been. Agatha noticed the change in his behavior before she had any specific information to attach it to. There was a quality to his absences, their frequency, their vagueness, the slight over-explanation when he did offer reasons, that registered as wrong before it registered as anything nameable. She wrote later, with the compressed precision she brought to everything, that she had felt something shift without being able to say what it was. The house in Sunningdale continued to function. Meals were made. Rosalind attended her lessons. The social calendar continued. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was published in June 1926 to strong reviews and immediate commercial success. The controversy about its ending generated the kind of public discussion that Agatha's previous novels had not. Letters to newspapers, debates in literary columns, readers writing to her directly. She was, by any external measure, at the height of her early career. The novel would later be cited as the book that established her reputation permanently. Archie read it. He said it was clever. He did not ask her how she had constructed it. Clara died in April 1926. She had been ill long enough that the death was not a surprise, but the experience of it was not diminished by anticipation. Agatha had been at Ashfield through the final weeks, managing the practicalities, the doctors, the household staff, the paperwork that death generates, while simultaneously experiencing a grief that she had no structure to process. Clara had been the one person in Agatha's life who had paid consistent, if idiosyncratic, attention to her inner world. The relationship had been absorbing, occasionally suffocating, and irreplaceable. She returned to Sunningdale after the funeral. Archie was sympathetic for a brief, definite period. Then he became restless in the way he became restless when emotional demands exceeded what he was willing to sustain. He suggested within weeks of Clara's death that Agatha might benefit from putting Ashfield up for sale. The house held too many memories, he said. It would be better to move forward. Agatha refused. It was one of the few direct refusals in the record of their marriage. By late summer 1926, Archie told her about Nancy Neal. He did not frame it as a confession. He framed it, by Agatha's account, as information she needed in order to make a decision. He wanted a divorce. He wanted to marry Nancy. He presented this as a reasonable proposition between adults. Agatha sat with this information in the house in Sunningdale while Rosalind slept upstairs. The autumn of 1926 had a particular quality of suspension. Archie had stated what he wanted. Agatha had not yet agreed to give it to him. They continued to occupy the same house in Sunningdale in a state that was neither marriage nor its end, a condition that required both of them to perform a version of ordinary domestic life, while the actual situation went unacknowledged in front of Rosalind, in front of neighbors, in front of the social world that would have opinions about it. Agatha was 35 years old. She had 6 published novels, a growing readership, and a reputation that was beginning to extend beyond England into European and American markets. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was in its 3rd printing. Letters from readers arrived regularly at the house in Sunningdale, addressed to her, full of the particular intimacy that readers extend to writers whose work has affected them. She answered some of them. She kept the letters in a drawer. None of this altered the atmosphere inside the house. There is a specific kind of public success that arrives at precisely the wrong private moment, that lands not as consolation, but as a kind of ironic counterweight, making the private failure feel more pronounced by contrast. Agatha's professional ascent in 1926 had exactly this quality. The reviews were good, the sales figures were good. Her publisher, John Lane at the Bodley Head, was pressing her for the next manuscript. The infrastructure of a successful literary career was assembling itself around her with a momentum that required her continued participation, regardless of what was happening at home. She had begun The Big Four during this period, a novel she would later describe with unusual candor as among her weakest. It was assembled partly from previously published short stories, stitched together with connective tissue that she wrote under conditions that were not conducive to careful construction. The book exists in her bibliography as a kind of artifact of the year, functional, competent, and noticeably lacking the structural precision that characterized her best work. She knew it while she was writing it. She finished it anyway because finishing was what was required. Archie's request for a divorce placed Agatha in a social position that had no comfortable resolution in 1926 England. Divorce was legal, but it carried a sustained stigma in the class world they inhabited. The world of Sunningdale, of golf clubs, of dinner parties organized around the implicit assumption that marriages were permanent arrangements. A divorced woman of 35 with a child faced a specific reconfiguration of her social existence. She would not be excluded from everything, but she would be repositioned. Invitations would shift, certain doors would close. The polite, managed distance that characterized upper-middle-class social interaction would become, for her, slightly more pronounced. She was also more immediately facing the specific practical reality that the house in Sunningdale, called Styles, with a pointed literary echo of her first novel, had been purchased on the assumption of two incomes, and that her income alone would not maintain it. The financial structure of the marriage had been organized around Archie's city salary as its primary foundation, with Agatha's novel income as supplement. If Archie left, that structure collapsed. She wrote to her literary agent about increasing her output. The letter was practical and entirely without self-pity. She was identifying a problem and addressing it. This was the mode she operated in when the emotional dimensions of a situation became too large. She found the actionable component and moved toward it. It was efficient. It was also, over years of practice, a method for not sitting fully inside what was actually happening to her. What was actually happening was this. The person she had organized the last 12 years of her life around had decided she was replaceable. He had not said this in those words. He had said he had fallen in love with someone else and wanted to be free to be with her. But the content of the message was the same. The marriage she had pursued had worked to sustain through years of managed distance and absorbed indifference, had been assessed by its other participant and found insufficient. He was leaving for someone uncomplicated by grief, by literary ambition, by the particular demands of a rich interior life that required acknowledgement to remain healthy. Nancy Neal was, by all surviving accounts, a perfectly pleasant woman. There is no evidence that she was calculating or deliberately cruel. She had not pursued a married man in any predatory sense. She had been available, and Archie had moved toward her. But her primary quality, from Archie's perspective, appears to have been the relief of simplicity. She inhabited his world without friction. She did not need him to be different from what he was. Agatha, by contrast, had needed him to be different for years without ever quite saying so. Her friendship network during this period was thin in the way that the friendships of women absorbed in marriage and motherhood often were, real but insufficiently load-bearing for a crisis of this magnitude. There was her sister Madge, now married and living at Abney Hall in Cheshire, with whom Agatha had a warm but not confessional relationship. There were neighbors and acquaintances from the Sunningdale social world who were more Archie's connections than hers. There was no single person to whom she was in the habit of saying what she actually thought. She had Clara for that. Clara was dead. In October 1926, Archie raised the subject again. He wanted a resolution. He had been patient, he said, a characterization that reflected his experience of the preceding months rather than Agatha's. He wanted to take Rosalind to a golf weekend in Godalming in early December. He was going with friends. Nancy would be there. He presented this too as information rather than request. Agatha agreed to the Godalming trip. The agreement appears in retrospect to have cost her something, not the specific permission, but the act of compliance itself, the continuation of the performance of reasonable adult negotiation around something that was not reasonable. She agreed, and Archie left for Godalming on December 3rd. That evening, Agatha put Rosalind to bed. She spoke briefly to her secretary, Carlo Fisher, who noted afterward that Agatha had seemed distressed. She went upstairs. Sometime later, she came back down. She picked up her coat. She got into the Morris Cowley. She did not leave a note. The Morris Cowley was found at approximately 8 o'clock on the morning of December 4th, 1926, by a gypsy laborer named Frederick Dorr, who was walking along the road near Newlands Corner in Surrey. The car had left the road and come to rest partway down a grassy slope, its front end embedded in a bush, its headlights still burning through the frost. The driver's door was open. Inside, a fur coat folded on the seat, a small suitcase in the back containing a few items of clothing, and an expired driving license made out to Agatha Christie. There was no sign of the driver. Dorr reported the car to local police. By mid-morning, the Surrey Constabulary had opened an investigation. By afternoon, the story had reached the London papers. By the following morning, December 5th, Agatha Christie's disappearance was on the front pages. The public response was immediate and large, in a way that surprised even the police coordinating the search. 15,000 volunteers eventually participated in the effort to find her. An extraordinary mobilization for a private individual in 1926, before organized mass media could generate such responses with any efficiency. The volunteers came because she was famous, but also because the scene at Newlands Corner had a quality of unresolved violence that the public found difficult to release. The abandoned car, the burning headlights, the coat left behind as though its owner had stepped out for a moment and would return. The Surrey police, led by Deputy Chief Constable William Kenward, focused their search on the area around the silent pool, a local beauty spot with a reputation rooted in folklore as a place associated with drowning. Divers searched the pool multiple times. They found nothing. The surrounding countryside was walked by volunteers in organized lines. Dogs were brought in. The riverway was dragged. For 11 days, nothing. Archie Christie was contacted at the Godalming golf party and returned to Sunningdale. His behavior during the search became almost immediately a subject of public scrutiny. He appeared composed in interviews with police and with the press, composed in a way that read to many observers as insufficient. He stated that his wife had been in a nervous state due to her mother's recent death. He did not mention the affair. He did not mention Nancy Neal. He expressed concern with the measured delivery of a man who had learned that emotional legibility was not something to be extended to strangers. The newspapers, operating in the gap between what they knew and what they could print, began to speculate. Some suggested accident. Some suggested deliberate self-harm. A small number suggested, with the careful indirection of libel law, that the husband might know more than he was saying. Archie gave a formal interview to the Daily Mail in which he described Agatha as having suffered a memory loss of some kind. He called her a devoted wife and mother. He used the past tense without appearing to notice. The investigation produced one significant lead: a banjo player at the Hydropathic Hotel in Harrogate, a large Victorian spa establishment in Yorkshire, reported that a woman matching Agatha Christie's description had been resident at the hotel for several days. She had registered under the name Teresa Neely of Cape Town. She had taken her meals in the dining room, attended the evening dances, read the newspapers that reported her own disappearance, and given no indication to other guests that anything was unusual. Deputy Chief Constable Kenward, who had been directing the Surrey search with considerable public investment of resources and reputation, was not the one who found her. It was a local Harrogate police officer, acting on the banjo player's tip, who went to the hotel on the evening of December 14th and identified her in the lounge. Agatha Christie was sitting in a chair, reading. She did not, by the officer's account, appear surprised to be found. She appeared to not quite recognize that finding was what was happening. She gave her name when asked as Teresa Neal. When the officer pressed further, something shifted in her expression. A return, a reorientation, the specific quality of a person coming back into a room they had not realized they had left. Archie was contacted and traveled to Harrogate the following morning. The reunion was conducted privately. No account of what passed between them was ever made public by either party. What Agatha told the attending physician at Harrogate was that she had no memory of the preceding 11 days. She did not know how she had arrived at the hotel. She did not know why she had registered under that name. She appeared genuinely distressed by the gaps, not in the performed way of someone managing a cover story, but in the particular distress of a person confronting an absence in their own continuity. The press did not accept this. The Daily News had offered a £100 reward for information leading to her discovery, and now wanted an accounting of what that reward had purchased. The coverage shifted from sympathy to suspicion, with the speed characteristic of public attention that has been made to feel deceived. The word used with increasing frequency was hoax. She had staged it, the narrative went, to embarrass Archie, to generate publicity, to manipulate the situation in her favor. These explanations required believing that a woman in the middle of a marital crisis had the organizational capacity and sustained emotional control to plant a false identity, travel to Yorkshire, maintain a fiction for 11 days in a public hotel, and then perform convincing amnesia to a physician and a police officer. The press preferred this explanation to the alternative, which was less containable. The alternative was that something had happened to Agatha Christie's mind under a weight of accumulated loss. Her mother's death, her marriage's collapse, the sustained performance of normality in a house where nothing was normal, that she herself did not fully understand and could not fully explain. That the disappearance had not been a plan but a rupture. That the Teresa Neal who sat in the Harrogate lounge reading newspapers about her own absence was not a disguise Agatha had put on, but something closer to the self that remained when everything else had been stripped away. Archie brought her back to Sunningdale. The house received them both. The return to Sunningdale was not a return to anything intact. The house received Agatha and Archie back in the way that houses receive people who have nowhere else immediately to go. Without judgment, without resolution, with the simple continuation of walls and rooms and the domestic routines that fill them. Rosalind was there. The secretary, Carlo Fisher, was there. The staff continued their functions. On the surface, the machinery of the household resumed, but the 11 days had changed the public dimension of their private situation in a way that could not be reversed. Before the disappearance, the Christie marriage had been failing in the manner of many marriages of that class and era, quietly, internally, with the difficulties managed inside the household and presented as nothing to the outside world. After the disappearance, Agatha Christie's name had been on the front pages of every major British newspaper for nearly a fortnight. The story had been covered internationally. Hundreds of thousands of people had a version of events, and that version, whatever its accuracy, now existed independently of anything Agatha or Archie chose to say or not say. The immediate medical situation was handled with the discretion that money and class made available. Agatha was seen by physicians who attributed her condition to a dissociative fugue, a genuine, if then poorly understood, psychological event triggered by acute emotional trauma. This diagnosis was conveyed to the police and, in general terms, to the press. It was not universally accepted. The formal investigation was closed. The Surrey Constabulary sent Archie a bill for the cost of the search, a detail that has the quality of dark comedy, the institutional world asserting its accounting against human collapse. Archie wanted the divorce proceeding as quickly as possible. The 11 days had not produced in him any revision of his intentions. If anything, the public spectacle and its attendant complications appeared to have hardened his desire to conclude the marriage and remove himself from its consequences. He raised the subject within weeks of Agatha's return from Harrogate. He was, he said, willing to be reasonable about the financial arrangements. He used the word reasonable with the confidence of someone who had already decided what reasonable meant. The negotiations over the divorce terms took place through solicitors, which meant they took place at the pace and in the register of legal correspondence, formal, bloodless, structured around the documentation of failure. Agatha was not without resources. Her novel income had been growing steadily, and she had a solicitor of her own who understood that the terms being offered were not as reasonable as Archie's framing suggested. The house in Sunningdale, Styles, was a particular point of contention. It had been purchased in both their names, and its disposal required agreement. Rosalind was 7 years old through all of this. She was a child who did not ask many questions, which was either a temperamental quality or an early learned adaptation to a household where questions about certain subjects were not welcomed. She went to her lessons. She ate her meals. She watched her parents with the careful, slightly remote attention that would characterize her relationship to emotional situations for the rest of her life. What she understood of what was happening, she did not say. What it cost her, she did not say later either. Agatha moved out of Styles in early 1927. She did not go back to Ashfield. The house in Torquay that Clara had left her was still in her possession, but it was full of her mother's things and her own childhood, and she was not ready for it. She took a service flat in London in Kensington, which had the quality of a temporary arrangement made permanent by the absence of anywhere better to go. Carlo Fisher came with her. Rosalind divided her time in the complicated, logistically managed way of children whose parents are separating. The divorce was granted in April 1928. The grounds were Archie's adultery, the legal mechanism available, and the one that placed the formal fault with him, while Agatha retained the appearance, at least in law, of the wronged party. In social reality, the situation was less clean. The press had spent 2 years maintaining a version of the story in which Agatha's 11-day disappearance was a manipulative act, and a portion of the public had accepted this version. The divorce, rather than clarifying her position, simply added another layer to a public identity that was becoming increasingly difficult to inhabit. Archie married Nancy Neal 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. He did so quietly, without announcement. They moved to a house in the country and began, by all accounts, a life of considerable contentment, organized around golf, sociability, and the profound ordinariness that Archie had apparently always been seeking. He largely disappeared from public attention. Nancy Neal Christie, as she became, gave no interviews about Agatha. Archie gave very few. The story, from his perspective, was finished. From Agatha's perspective, it was not finished because it continued to follow her. Every interview she gave, and she gave as few as she could, included questions about the 11 days. Every profile written about her circled back to Newlands Corner and Harrogate. The disappearance had become the frame through which her work was read, the first thing mentioned in any public context, the detail that preceded her in every room she entered. She had written 7 novels by this point. The disappearance received more sustained public attention than all of them combined. She handled this with a containment that was visible as containment, the slight withdrawal, the careful phrasing, the eyes that registered a question's full implication before returning a response calibrated to reveal as little as possible. Journalists noted that she was difficult to interview. What they meant was that she declined to perform the emotional accessibility they required. What she had survived was hers. She had no intention of making it available. Her sister Madge invited her to Abney Hall for Christmas 1927. Agatha went, bringing Rosalind. Abney Hall was large, comfortable, and organized around the cheerful, well-resourced bustle of Madge's family life. A contrast to everything Agatha was navigating that was either restorative or simply overwhelming, depending on the day. She sat at Madge's dining table and ate well and spoke pleasantly, and went to bed at reasonable hours. She was 37 years old. The marriage was legally over. The public story about her had calcified into a shape she had not chosen. Rosalind was watching everything with those careful, unreadable eyes. She began writing again. The Harrogate that Agatha Christie entered sometime around December 4th, 1926, was a town built almost entirely around the idea of restoration. It had been a spa destination since the 17th century, its sulfur and iron springs drawing the ill, the exhausted, and the wealthy seeking recalibration. The Hydropathic Hotel, known locally as the Hydro, was its largest establishment, a Victorian pile of considerable ambition, set on high ground above the town, its corridors long and gaslit, its public rooms organized around the rituals of therapeutic leisure. There were baths. There were treatments. There was a dining room that served 3 meals a day with the punctual reliability of an institution that understood its guests needed structure more than novelty. Teresa Neal of Cape Town checked in on approximately December 4th. She paid in advance. She was given a room on an upper floor with a view over the grounds. She unpacked her small suitcase. What she did during those 11 days is known in outline and almost entirely opaque in texture. She ate in the dining room. She attended the evening dances in the ballroom, where a small orchestra played and guests moved through the formalities of polite recreation. She spoke to other guests with the pleasant surface-level sociability that such environments require and reward. She read the newspapers. Several guests later recalled her as agreeable company, quiet, well-mannered, not memorable in any particular way. One woman remembered discussing knitting with her. Another recalled a conversation about the spa treatments. Nobody recalled anything that suggested distress. The newspapers she read reported her own disappearance in escalating detail. The search at Newlands Corner, the diving of the silent pool, the volunteers moving across the Surrey countryside in organized lines. Her photograph, the same one used repeatedly, taken some years before and showing a woman of composed, pleasant appearance, appearing on front pages alongside headlines that speculated about her fate. She sat in the dining room of the Hydro and read these accounts and gave no indication to anyone nearby that the woman in the photograph was the woman reading about her. Whether this requires explanation as deception or as dissociation depends on what actually happened to Agatha Christie's mind in the early hours of December 4th, and that question has no definitive answer. The medical literature on dissociative fugue, a condition in which a person, under extreme psychological stress, effectively vacates their ordinary identity and constructs or adopts an alternative one, describes exactly the profile of the Harrogate episode. The person in a fugue state is not performing. They are not consciously maintaining a fiction. They are operating from a different organizational center, one that has temporarily displaced the primary self. The name Theresa Neal is the detail that resists clean medical explanation. It was not a random name. It was the surname of the woman for whom Archie was leaving her. Whether this was an unconscious surfacing, the mind in extremity, reaching for the name most charged with significance, or something more deliberate, something between the two states, is not resolvable from the outside. Agatha did not resolve it. She said, in the limited statements she made afterward, that she did not know why she had used that name. This may have been true in the only sense that mattered to her. She did not consciously know. The Harrogate police officer who identified her on the evening of December 14th was acting on the report from the hotel's banjo player, Bob Tappan, who had recognized her photograph in a newspaper and contacted the authorities. The identification was made in the hotel lounge, where Agatha was sitting in one of the large chairs that such lounges provided for the comfortable passage of undemanding time. The officer approached. There was a conversation. Archie was called. He arrived the following morning by train. The reunion took place in a private room at the Hydro. No staff member was present. No account was made public. What is known is that they left Harrogate together and returned south, and that Agatha was examined by a physician in Harrogate before leaving, and that the physician's notes described a patient in a state of genuine confusion about recent events. The press gathered outside the Hydro as the Christies departed. Photographers captured images of Agatha in a coat and hat, her face carrying an expression that is genuinely difficult to read across the decades. Not distressed, not relieved, somewhere between present and not fully present, the expression of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of something they did not know they were doing. The coverage that followed the recovery was extensive and largely unkind. The Daily News, which had funded part of the search and offered the reward, ran a story suggesting the entire episode had been engineered. Other papers followed with variations on the same premise. The word frequently used was stunt. A small number of voices, medical professionals, a few sympathetic columnists, argued for the dissociative explanation. They were minority voices. The dominant public narrative had already fixed. Arthur Conan Doyle, whose wife had recently died and who had become deeply committed to spiritualism in his grief, consulted a medium about Agatha's whereabouts during the search. He gave the medium one of Agatha's gloves. The medium produced a location that bore no relation to Harrogate. This detail, the creator of the world's most famous rational detective consulting a spirit medium about the whereabouts of the woman who had, in some ways, inherited his genre, exists in the historical record with the quality of something a novelist might have invented. Dorothy L. Sayers, who was in the process of establishing her own detective fiction career, commented publicly that the Disappearance was damaging to the reputation of the genre. She did not elaborate on what she thought had actually happened. Agatha gave one formal public statement about the 11 days. It was brief, attributed the episode to a nervous breakdown consequent on her mother's death and personal difficulties, and contained nothing that anyone who wanted a different explanation was required to accept. She gave no further public statements about it for the remaining 50 years of her life. The hotel in Harrogate continued to operate. It eventually became a conference center. The room where Theresa Neal of Cape Town slept for 11 nights in December 1926 was subsequently occupied by delegates attending industry seminars, and later by tourists who had read about the Christie connection and booked it specifically for that reason. The story the British press constructed about Agatha Christie in the weeks and months following her recovery from Harrogate was not a single narrative. It was several narratives running simultaneously, occasionally contradicting each other, united primarily by their shared confidence that the truth of the 11 days was something other than what Agatha had said. This multiplicity did not create doubt in the public mind. It created a kind of ambient suspicion that attached itself to her name and remained there, requiring no specific accusation to sustain itself. The hoax theory was the most persistent. Its logic was emotional rather than evidential. It felt like the kind of thing a wronged woman might do, a dramatic gesture calibrated to embarrass a straying husband and generate public sympathy. That it also required believing Agatha had the organizational capacity of a military planner while in the middle of an acute psychological crisis did not significantly trouble its proponents. The theory satisfied a need to contain the episode within recognizable human motivation. A calculating woman was easier to process than a mind that had simply ceased under sufficient pressure to hold itself together. The newspapers that had invested most heavily in the search, the Daily News with its reward, the various papers that had run daily front-page coverage, had a particular institutional stake in the hoax reading. They had mobilized public concern, deployed resources, and generated considerable drama around what turned out to be, if the medical explanation was correct, a private psychological collapse. The hoax theory allowed them to reframe their coverage as investigative rather than manipulated. It made them participants in an unmasking rather than victims of a deception. Dorothy Sayers' comment about damage to the genre's reputation reflected a specific anxiety circulating among detective fiction writers at the time. The genre operated on a contract with its readers, a promise that the puzzle had a solution, that the apparent chaos of a crime scene would resolve into coherent cause and effect. Agatha's disappearance, in its genuine irresolvability, violated this contract in public. It generated a real-world mystery that did not resolve into explanation, and this was uncomfortable for everyone professionally invested in the idea that mysteries resolved. Agatha understood the shape of the problem she now occupied in the public imagination. She had spent years developing an acute sensitivity to how people constructed narratives. It was the fundamental skill of the detective fiction writer, the ability to see how a sequence of events could be read in multiple ways and to understand which reading an observer would instinctively choose. She could see exactly what the press had done with her disappearance and exactly why it had been done. This understanding did not give her any mechanism to undo it. She made a decision, sometime in 1927, that she would not attempt to correct the public record. This was not a passive decision. It was an active one, made with full awareness of its costs. She had seen enough of how the press operated to understand that any statement she made would generate further coverage, further speculation, further opportunities for the story to be re-examined and re-narrated in directions she could not control. Silence was the only posture that offered any containment. The coverage would continue regardless. At least silence preserved something, not her reputation, which was already fixed in the public version, but some interior portion of the experience that remained hers. The cost of this decision was carried into every professional interaction for the rest of her career. Interviews were constrained by the subject she would not discuss, which meant interviewers inevitably attempted to reach it through adjacent questions. And Agatha spent the duration of every interview conducting a careful defensive perimeter. She became known as a difficult subject, uncooperative, evasive, suspiciously private for a public figure. These characterizations were not inaccurate as descriptions of behavior. They simply omitted the reasons. Her publisher, by 1927 William Collins rather than the Bodley Head, after a contractual transition she had negotiated with considerably more sophistication than her first contract, was navigating the commercial implications of the story with the pragmatic attention of a business that had a significant financial interest in Agatha's continued productivity and public profile. Collins understood that the disappearance, whatever its truth, had made Agatha Christie's name more widely known than any of her novels had yet managed. There was a market dimension to the notoriety that was uncomfortable to acknowledge, but impossible to ignore. Her readership, during 1927 and 1928, grew. This was partly the natural progression of a career that had been building steadily, but it was also partly the morbid curiosity that attaches to public figures who have become associated with unresolved drama. People who had not read her novels before the disappearance read them afterward, looking for what exactly is difficult to specify. Some trace of the interior life that had produced the episode, some clue planted in the fiction to what had actually happened. They found instead precisely constructed puzzles with clean solutions, narrated with a calm analytical intelligence that gave nothing of its author away. This too was read as suspicious by those already committed to suspicion. It was taken as evidence of coldness, of calculation, of a woman who had always been managing appearances. What it actually was craft. The ability to construct an exterior that served a purpose regardless of what was happening interior to it. This was a skill Agatha had been developing since the Edwardian drawing rooms of her girlhood, since the debutante season, where she had learned to be pleasantly present while remaining essentially elsewhere. The novels were not hiding something. They were the product of a mind that had always operated most freely in the space between observation and revelation, withholding just enough to make the withholding itself the engine of the story. By 1928, the coverage had not stopped but had begun to thin. Other stories displaced it. Other names occupied the front pages. Agatha moved through her days in the Kensington flat, writing, managing Rosalind's arrangements, corresponding with Collins about the next manuscript. The public story about her continued to exist in its fixed form. The hoax, the calculating woman, the unsolved mystery, available for retrieval whenever a journalist needed context for a profile or a review. She did not read the profiles if she could avoid it. She read the reviews, noted what was useful, and returned to work. The decree absolute came through in April 1928. It was a legal document, clean and final in the way that legal documents are clean and final. The formal conclusion of a process that had been in motion since Archie's statement in the summer of 1926. Agatha received it at the Kensington flat. Carlo Fisher was there. Rosalind was at school. There is no record of how Agatha spent the rest of that day. What followed the legal conclusion was a social recalibration that proceeded slowly and without announcement. Divorce. In 1928, England was not the catastrophic social event it had been a generation earlier. The King Edward VII era of drawing-room scandals and enforced exile from polite society had given way to something slightly more managed, slightly more tolerant of marital failure among people of sufficient means and discretion. But slightly more tolerant is not tolerant, and the specific circumstances of the Christie divorce, the public disappearance, the press coverage, the narrative of the wronged wife that had been constructed and then undermined by the hoax theory, meant that Agatha's social position was more complicated than a straightforward divorce would have produced. She was invited to fewer things. This happened gradually, in the way that social exclusion tends to happen among people of that class, not through explicit withdrawal, but through the slow attrition of invitations not extended, events not mentioned, gatherings that seemed to occur without her knowledge until she heard about them afterward. The Sunningdale social world, which had always been more Archie's than hers, largely closed. The London literary world remained partially accessible, though it had its own hierarchies and its own discomforts around a figure who carried public notoriety into rooms that preferred their complications private. She was 37, divorced with a 9-year-old daughter, a growing literary career, and a public identity shaped primarily by an event she refused to discuss. The marriage market, which was still in 1928 a relevant frame for assessing the situation of a woman in her position, regarded her with a specific ambivalence. She was not poor, she was not old. She was not, by any objective measure, without qualities that made sustained companionship plausible. But she was complicated in a public way, and public complication was a liability that required either significant courage or significant indifference to absorb. Rosalind was navigating a version of this from the position of a child in a good school, surrounded by children whose parents had not been on the front pages. She did not complain about this as far as the record shows. She developed with considerable thoroughness the armored self-containment that would characterize her as an adult, a manner so controlled and so resistant to sentiment that people who encountered her later in life frequently found her alarming. What she thought about her parents' divorce, about the 11 days, about the particular quality of growing up as the child of a famous woman defined by public mystery, she did not say then and would not say clearly later. Agatha's relationship with Rosalind during these years was sustained, materially attentive, and emotionally proximate without being emotionally transparent. She was present. She managed the practical dimensions of Rosalind's life with care and competence. She did not discuss with her daughter what had happened at Newland's Corner, or what had preceded it in the marriage, or what the divorce meant beyond its logistical consequences. This was partly the protective instinct of a parent trying to spare a child from adult difficulty. It was also a continuation of the same pattern that had characterized Agatha's management of emotional reality throughout her adult life. The difficult thing acknowledged in its practical dimensions and sealed in its interior ones. The financial settlement from the divorce gave Agatha sufficient resources to maintain the Kensington flat and Rosalind's schooling without immediate crisis. Her novel income was growing. The Mystery of the Blue Train, published in 1928, was not among her strongest works. She said so herself, describing it later as written under conditions of sustained misery with technical competence substituting for genuine engagement. It sold well regardless. Her readership did not know, reading it, that it had been assembled by a woman in the middle of a legal dissolution and a social recalibration. It read as a Poirot novel. That was what was required of it. Her agent was pressing for more Poirot. Her publisher was pressing for more Poirot. Poirot had become, by 1928, the commercial engine of her career. The character whose name on a cover sold copies with a reliability that transcended any individual book's quality. Agatha had a complicated relationship with this fact. She had created Poirot in 1916 partly as a formal exercise, a detective defined by the application of pure intelligence to observable evidence, a deliberate construction rather than an autobiographical projection. He was, in almost every way, unlike her, foreign, vain, domestic in his habits, ostentatiously logical. The distance between his certainty and her ambiguity was the point. She had already begun privately to find him exhausting. The little gray cells, the precise mustaches, the requirement that he arrive at each novel's conclusion with a complete and elegant explanation of every element that had seemed mysterious. He was a machine for resolution in a period of her life when nothing resolved. Writing him required her to perform a confidence in the knowability of human behavior that her actual experience was persistently undermining. She began, during 1928, to spend more time at Ashfield. The house in Torquay had been sitting largely unused since Clara's death, maintained by a skeleton staff at expense that Agatha could now barely sustain. Going back to it meant going back through her mother's furniture, her mother's arrangements, the particular atmosphere of a house organized around a personality that no longer occupied it. She spent the first visit largely clearing things out, making decisions about what Clara had left, which required handling each object and placing it in a category. She found this useful. It was work with visible progress, unlike the other work she was doing. Madge came down from Cheshire for part of the Ashfield visit. They went through Clara's papers together. They found letters, photographs, the accumulated material of a life. They were mostly quiet about what they found. Madge was practical and warm in the way she had always been, the older sister who moved through difficulty without excessive examination of it. Agatha was grateful for this. She did not say so with any great specificity. They drank tea in Clara's sitting room and sorted through boxes. It was, she said later, one of the better weeks of that year. The invitation came through the Baghdad Railway. In the autumn of 1928, Agatha received a suggestion from friends. The Owens, a couple she knew through the peripheral social connections that remained after the divorce had restructured her world, that she might enjoy a journey on the Orient Express to Baghdad, then onward to the British archaeological excavations at Ur in southern Iraq. The friends made it sound restorative, a change of scene. The Middle East was fashionable among a certain class of British traveler at the time. Not fashionable in the mass tourism sense, but in the sense that it offered a combination of genuine remoteness and sufficient British institutional presence to feel manageable. There were officials, excavations, rest houses. There was enough infrastructure to make the foreignness navigable without making it domestic. Agatha went alone. This was not, in 1928, an entirely unremarkable thing for a woman of her class and means to do, but it was not unremarkable either. She boarded the Orient Express at Calais in the late autumn with a trunk and a smaller bag and no companion, and moved eastward through Europe and into Turkey, and then down through what was then British-mandated territory toward Baghdad. She described the journey later with an enthusiasm that was notably different in quality from the careful, measured way she described most things. Something genuinely lit in the language, a pleasure in movement and difference, and the specific freedom of being entirely unknown. In Baghdad, she stayed at the British Residency. There were dinners, officials, the social machinery of the imperial administrative world. She was Agatha Christie, the novelist, which meant something in these circles. Detective fiction was widely read among the British abroad, partly for the comfort of its Englishness, and partly because extended postings to remote locations created a sustained appetite for narrative. People had opinions about Poirot. She listened, contributed, and felt, by her own account, considerably more at ease than she had felt in any English social context for at least 2 years. Ur was operated under the direction of Leonard Woolley, whose excavations of the Royal Cemetery had generated international attention in the early 1920s. His wife Catherine managed the social dimensions of the dig site with a formidable control that Agatha observed with the alert, privately amused attention she brought to strong personalities. Catherine Woolley was beautiful, demanding, and organized the dig house's social life around her own preferences with a completeness that left most guests uncertain whether they were being entertained or managed. Agatha concluded they were being managed, found this clarifying, and adapted accordingly. It was at that she met Max Mallowan. He was 25 years old, 14 years her junior, and working as Leonard Woolley's assistant. He was Oxford-educated, the son of an Austrian father and a French mother, with a precision of intellect and a patience in conversation that Agatha found, after years of Archie's managed indifference, almost disorienting. He was genuinely interested in what she said. He asked questions and then listened to the answers. He did not redirect conversations toward himself when they had gone on long enough to require reciprocal attention. He was also, by all available evidence, entirely untroubled by the public story that followed Agatha's name. He had read her novels. He had not read the newspaper coverage of the disappearance with any particular investment. He was from a world, classical archaeology, its particular community of scholars and diggers and institutional supporters, that was sufficiently removed from the English social world that had produced and sustained the Christie narrative to regard it without the ambient suspicion that narrative had generated. He met her as a novelist and a traveler, and this is largely how he continued to meet her. When Catherine Woolley's car broke down during Agatha's visit and Max was assigned to escort Agatha back to Baghdad by alternative transport, a multi-day journey across the desert by car, the time produced by that enforced proximity operated in the way that travel time sometimes operates between two people who are genuinely compatible. They talked at length about archaeology, about novels, about the particular quality of the desert landscape they were moving through. Agatha was 38, Max was 24. Neither appeared to find the age difference a primary consideration. She returned to England. She wrote to Max. He wrote back. The correspondence continued through 1929 and into 1930 with a regularity that indicated mutual intention. Agatha was also during this period writing at a sustained pace, The Seven Dials Mystery. In 1929, The Murder at the Vicarage. In 1930, the first Miss Marple novel, which introduced a character she would not initially value as highly as her readership did, and which would become, over decades, the vehicle for some of her most careful thinking about the relationship between surface appearance and interior reality. Miss Marple was an elderly spinster in a small English village who solved murders by understanding human behavior through long, patient observation. She was not glamorous. She was not foreign or eccentric or ostentatiously brilliant. She was a woman who had spent a great deal of time watching people and had drawn careful conclusions from what she saw. The men around her consistently underestimated her. They were consistently wrong to do so. Agatha insisted for years that Marple was not based on anyone she knew. This was probably technically true in the sense that no single person provided the model. It was less convincing as a description of where the character's fundamental architecture came from. Max proposed in 1930 at Ashfield, during a visit that Agatha had arranged partly to show him where she had come from. He proposed in the garden. She said later that she had been uncertain. not about him specifically, but about the institution, about whether the legal and social structure of marriage was one she wanted to re-enter after what the first one had cost her. She took several days to answer. She discussed it with no one except, apparently, Rosalind, who was 11 years old, and responded to the proposal with the measured, slightly cool assessment that was already her characteristic mode. Rosalind said she thought it was all right. They were married on September 11th, 1930, at a registry office in Edinburgh. The ceremony was small and without announcement. Agatha was 40 years old. She kept her professional name. The excavation seasons operated on a calendar that divided the year with the reliability of an agricultural cycle. From autumn through spring, Max worked in the field, first continuing at Ur under Woolley, then leading his own digs at sites in Syria and Iraq that he identified and secured funding for through the institutional network of British and European archaeology. From late spring through early autumn, he and Agatha returned to England. The marriage was organized around this rhythm from the beginning, and the rhythm produced something that functioned, from a distance, as a companionable and productive arrangement. Agatha went to the excavations. This was not assumed. It was a choice she made actively and renewed each season, packing for months in the field with the same methodical attention she brought to manuscript preparation. She learned to develop photographs in a makeshift darkroom at the dig site. She washed and cataloged pottery fragments. She repaired delicate finds with a fine brush and a solution. She mixed herself, her apothecary training from the Torquay dispensary, finding an application she could not have predicted. She was useful at the sites in the specific practical way that she was useful most places, without requiring acknowledgement, without disrupting the established operations, absorbing the work available, and doing it competently. The sites themselves, Nineveh, then Chagar Bazar in Syria, then Tel Brak, then Nimrud, were places of considerable physical difficulty. The accommodations were basic. Water was managed carefully. The heat in certain seasons was extreme. The local labor required daily management that combined technical instruction with the sustained patience of cross-cultural communication, conducted partly through intermediaries. Agatha observed all of this from a position that was neither fully participant nor fully observer. She was the director's wife, which meant she had a defined social role without a defined professional one, and she navigated this ambiguity with the adaptability she had been practicing since childhood, she wrote at the digs. This is the detail that is easily stated and requires some consideration to fully register. She wrote detective novels, intricately plotted, precisely constructed narratives requiring sustained concentration and the management of multiple converging lines of evidence, in a mud brick house in the Syrian desert, at a table with inadequate light, surrounded by the noise and movement of a working excavation, while simultaneously managing the household logistics of feeding and accommodating a team of archaeologists. She produced during the 1930s some of her most technically accomplished work under these conditions. Murder on the Orient Express was written in Damascus in 1933. Death on the Nile drew directly on the landscape and atmosphere of the Near Eastern travels. And Then There Were None, which would become one of the best-selling novels of the 20th century, was completed in 1939. The productivity was extraordinary by any measure. Between 1930 and 1940, she published 17 novels, a collection of stories, and several plays. The output had the quality of controlled pressure, a sustained release of energy that suggested not ease, but the disciplined management of a great deal of interior material. She wrote in this period, without the interruptions of marital difficulty, without the sustained performance of a failing domestic situation. The material conditions of the second marriage, the absence of the particular kind of emotional drain that the first marriage had produced, were clearly operative. She was not happy in the effortless sense. She was working, which for her was its own category of functional well-being. Max's career was advancing with the support that Agatha's income made possible. This dimension of the marriage is present in the historical record but has not been prominently examined. Archaeological fieldwork required funding for permits, for equipment, for the wages of local laborers, for the institutional affiliations and publications that established a scholar's standing in the field. Max's digs were partially supported by grants from the British School of Archaeology in Iraq and similar bodies, but these grants were insufficient for the scale of work he was conducting. Agatha's novel income supplemented them. She made this possible without apparent resentment and without making it a subject of discussion. Her accountant understood the arrangement. Max understood the arrangement. It was not discussed as an arrangement. There was in this a structural echo of the first marriage that was not identical, but was not entirely different. In the first marriage, Agatha's income had been supplementary, present but not acknowledged as significant. In the second marriage, her income was primary to the work that defined her husband's life, present and significant, but similarly not foregrounded as a fact about the relationship's balance. In both cases, the financial reality was managed around rather than through. This was, in part, the convention of the time. Money in marriage was not a subject that the class world they inhabited discussed with any directness, but convention explains the form, not necessarily the content of what it contained. Rosalind's relationship with Max was civil and remained so. She was 11 when they married, 17 when the war began, and by then sufficiently formed in her own temperament to regard Max as a fixed feature of the landscape rather than as a parental figure requiring emotional engagement. Max was careful with her, attentive in the way of an intelligent man who understood that the situation required care, and who had the self-awareness to provide it without pressing for warmth that was not offered. They maintained over decades a relationship of mutual respect that had the quality of a successful negotiation rather than an affection. The war interrupted the excavation seasons in 1939 and did not resume them until the late 1940s. Max went to work for the RAF in intelligence and was posted to North Africa and Cairo. Agatha remained in London, working as a volunteer dispenser at University College Hospital. The same pharmaceutical work she had done in Torquay during the First War, performed now in a city being bombed, in a hospital managing casualties at a scale that the Torquay dispensary had not prepared her for. She worked regular shifts. She took the tube in during raids when the surface was considered less safe. She did not write about this experience in any direct way. The flat she and Max kept in London was damaged in the Blitz. They moved their possessions to Lawn Road Flats in Hampstead, a modernist block that housed, during the war years, an improbable concentration of European émigrés and British intellectuals. Agatha worked and wrote and waited for Max's letters from Cairo, which arrived with the irregular frequency of wartime correspondence. She was 50 years old. She had been married for 10 years. The second marriage was working in the ways that the first had not, and she understood well enough what this meant. By the time the war ended and Max returned from Cairo in 1945, Agatha Christie was the most widely read detective fiction writer in the English language. This was not a gradual accumulation that she had watched arrive. It was more like a condition she found herself inside when she looked up from the work, a scale of readership and commercial reach that had assembled itself around her name, while she had been occupied with manuscripts, dig seasons, hospital shifts, and the management of a life that required constant practical attention. The numbers, by the mid-1940s, were genuinely difficult to contextualize. Her novels were being translated into dozens of languages, and then there were none had sold in quantities that placed it among the best-selling novels in the world, a claim that was not marketing language, but a measurable fact about print runs and territorial rights and the accumulated weight of a readership spread across continents. Her publisher Collins was navigating the commercial logistics of her output with the careful attention of an institution that understood it was managing something unusually valuable. Her agent was handling rights negotiations across territories with a complexity that required dedicated attention. Agatha understood none of this in detail. She understood it in the way that a person understands the existence of weather. She knew it was there, that it had consequences, that it operated according to forces she could not personally control. She signed what was put before her with less scrutiny than the situation warranted. Her early contracts, going back to the disastrous Bodley Head Agreement for Styles, had established a pattern of signing without sufficient negotiation, and while this had improved with experience and professional guidance, she retained a fundamental discomfort with the business dimension of her work that left her consistently at a disadvantage in the transactions that shaped her financial life. The tax situation was serious, and became more serious through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Britain's post-war tax structure imposed extremely high marginal rates on high earners, and Agatha's income, substantial, arriving from multiple sources in multiple territories, placed her in a category of liability that required professional management she had not organized with sufficient foresight. Her accountant developed a series of arrangements intended to manage the exposure, including the creation of a company, Agatha Christie Limited, into which the rights to her work were transferred. This structure offered some protection but required her to sell the rights to her own characters into the company, a transaction whose long-term implications she did not fully understand at the time, and that would produce complications she did not live to see resolved. She continued to write with the regularity of someone for whom writing was less a creative act than a metabolic one, something the system required to continue functioning. 2 novels a year, in most years of the 1940s and 1950s, plus plays, plus short stories. The plays had begun in earnest with 10 Little Niggers adapted for the stage in 1943, and the theatrical work would eventually produce The Mousetrap, which opened in London's West End in 1952 and ran without interruption for decades, becoming the longest-running theatrical production in history. Agatha attended the opening night. She wore a practical dress and sat in the stalls and watched the audience watching her work and gave no interview afterward that revealed anything she actually thought about the experience. The persona that had developed around her public name by the 1950s was remarkably complete as a piece of self-protective construction. She was the Queen of Crime, a title she had not claimed and could not disclaim, a label that efficiently replaced any other description with a category. The Queen of Crime was elderly, white-haired, tweed-wearing, pleasantly English, reclusive, conservative, fond of gardens and archaeological expeditions, and a particular brand of mild domestic comedy. This image was not entirely false. It was a selection from reality, made with the instinct of someone who had learned that offering the public a version of yourself that satisfies their requirements leaves the actual self relatively undisturbed. She gave interviews rarely and on terms that were non-negotiable. No questions about the disappearance, no questions about Archie, no questions about Rosalind except in the most general terms. What remained available for discussion was the work, the mechanics of plotting, the characters, the general principles of the detective fiction form. And Agatha could discuss these things with genuine interest and considerable intelligence because they were the things she actually thought about. The interviews that resulted were professional and unrevealing, and the journalists who conducted them generally noted afterward that she was not what they had expected, without being able to specify precisely what they had expected. Her reclusion from the public world deepened through the 1950s. She had acquired a house called Greenway in Devon on the Dart Estuary in 1938, a Georgian property of considerable beauty that she had purchased with the specific pleasure of someone acquiring something that required nothing from her except the decision to have it. Greenway became her preferred retreat, the garden, the river, the specific quality of the Devon light that she had grown up with in Torquay, and that required no adjustment on her part, being simply the atmosphere her nervous system recognized as default. She walked in the garden. She read extensively, not detective fiction, which she found largely unsatisfying, but novels of other kinds, history, the archaeological literature that Max's work generated. She cooked when she felt like it, with the straightforward pleasure of someone who had learned to find competence in physical tasks, restorative. She was not a woman who required company to function. She required quiet, sufficient space, and the continued availability of a problem that required solving, which the next manuscript always provided. Max returned to the field in the late 1940s. The excavations at Nimrud in Iraq began in 1949 and continued through the 1950s, producing significant finds and establishing Max's reputation as a serious archaeologist of the first rank. Agatha went to Nimrud. She washed pottery. She photographed finds. She wrote in the dig house in the early mornings before the day's work began. She was in her 60s at Nimrud, moving more slowly than she had at Ur in 1928, but present and useful and apparently content in the particular way she was content when the day had structure and the work was clear. The public did not know about Nimrud. The public knew about the Queen of Crime, who lived in a country house and had white hair and was working on the next Poirot. Both things were true. They did not communicate with each other. Rosalind Christie was born in August 1919 into a household that was already organized around managed appearances. She was 7 years old when her mother disappeared and her father's affair became the subject of national newspaper coverage. She was 9 when the divorce was finalized. She was 11 when her mother married Max Mallowan in a registry office in Edinburgh, without significant ceremony or announcement. By the time she was an adolescent, she had accumulated a considerable quantity of experience with the gap between how things appeared and how they were. And she had drawn from this experience the conclusions that a certain kind of intelligence draws, that surfaces require management, that sentiment is unreliable, that the safest position is one of controlled distance. She was educated at good schools, managed with the material competence that Agatha brought to all logistical problems involving Rosalind's welfare. The schools were selected carefully. The fees were paid without difficulty once Agatha's income had stabilized. The clothes were appropriate. The arrangements for holidays and half-terms were organized with attention to Rosalind's comfort. What the schools and the arrangements could not provide was a model for how to inhabit emotional life, because the person best positioned to provide that model was operating throughout Rosalind's childhood and adolescence, from behind a set of barriers that had been constructed under genuine necessity and could not be selectively lowered. Agatha loved Rosalind. This is not in doubt from any source. But love in this context operated through provision, through protection, through the sustained management of Rosalind's external circumstances, rather than through the kind of emotional transparency that might have given Rosalind a different set of tools for her own inner life. What Rosalind observed over years of careful watching was a mother who handled difficulty by containing it, who maintained functional competence under conditions that would have visibly unmade other people, and who revealed almost nothing of the interior cost of this management. Rosalind took careful notes. The result was a woman who became, as an adult, one of the more formidable personalities in the British literary world, not through the production of literature herself, but through the control of it. Rosalind married Hubert Pritchard in 1940. He was killed in action in 1944, leaving her a widow at 24 with a young son, Matthew. She remarried in 1949 to Anthony Hicks, a barrister with interests in Tibetan studies who provided the kind of steady, intellectually substantial companionship that suited her. The second marriage was, by all accounts, genuinely good, but it was her relationship to Agatha's work, and to the public story about Agatha's life, that defined Rosalind's position in the wider world. And this relationship had a quality that became increasingly pronounced as Agatha's fame grew. Rosalind became, progressively through the 1950s and 1960s, the guardian of her mother's image and estate with a thoroughness that went beyond ordinary filial responsibility. She controlled access to Agatha with a specificity that made journalists and biographers and literary researchers understand quickly that Rosalind's approval was required before anything proceeded, and that Rosalind's approval was not easily obtained. She turned down interview requests on Agatha's behalf. She screened correspondence. She vetted the people who were permitted to spend time with Agatha at Greenway or at Winterbrook, the house in Wallingford that became the Mallowans' primary England residence through the 1950s. She did this with a directness that left no ambiguity about where authority lay. She was not performing guardianship. She was exercising it, with the conviction of someone who had spent decades watching the world misrepresent her mother and had concluded that controlled access was the only reliable protection. Agatha allowed this. She permitted Rosalind's management of her public exposure with a compliance that had multiple possible explanations, and probably contained elements of all of them. There was genuine relief in having someone else manage the dimension of her life she found most draining: the public demands, the interview requests, the correspondence that required response. There was also perhaps something that functioned as restitution, a giving over of control to Rosalind as a partial acknowledgement of what Rosalind had absorbed during the years when Agatha had been unable to protect her from the visibility of adult failure. And there was possibly the simpler fact that Rosalind was very good at it. She was effective, thorough, and completely unintimidated by the world's interest in her mother's name. What this arrangement produced over time was a version of Agatha Christie that was extremely managed and correspondingly opaque. The authorized version, the one Rosalind permitted, was the tweed-wearing queen of crime, the archaeological wife, the woman of pleasant domestic habits and mildly conservative views. It was not false. It was a selection. The selection was made by a woman who had learned from a childhood spent observing her mother's public misrepresentation that the only safe version of a person to present to the world is the one that offers nothing the world can use against them. Agatha's autobiography, written during the 1950s and published posthumously in 1977, is the document that most clearly shows both what Rosalind's influence produced and what it cost. The book is beautifully written, controlled, funny in the specific dry way of Agatha's best prose, alive to the textures of the Edwardian childhood and the Egyptian travels in the dig seasons. It is also one of the great works of strategic omission in the literary memoir tradition. The Disappearance receives several pages that say almost nothing. Archie is present, but barely examined. The emotional interior of the marriage, its deterioration, what the 11 days actually were. These are managed with a precision of avoidance that takes real skill to sustain across several hundred pages. Rosalind read the autobiography before it was published. She had input into what it contained. The nature and extent of this input has not been fully documented. What passed between Agatha and Rosalind in private, in the conversations that took place at Greenway over decades, in the letters they exchanged when they were not in the same place, is almost entirely unknown. Rosalind controlled the archive after Agatha's death with the same thoroughness she had brought to controlling access to Agatha in life. Certain correspondence was released. Certain correspondence was not. The gap between what survives and what was removed is not measurable, which is perhaps precisely the point. In 1955, the Mystery Writers of America named Agatha Christie the first Grand Master of detective fiction, a lifetime achievement designation that acknowledged her position at the center of a genre she had helped define over 3 decades. She did not attend the ceremony. She sent a note of thanks that was gracious, brief, and gave nothing away. The award was accepted on her behalf by a representative whose name does not appear prominently in accounts of the evening. This was, by the mid-1950s, a pattern rather than an exception. The honors arrived with increasing frequency, and Agatha was present at approximately none of them. The mechanism was consistent. An award was announced, a note was sent, a representative collected it, the proceedings continued without her. She was becoming, in the middle of extraordinary professional recognition, progressively more absent from her own public life. Not through eccentricity or calculated mystique, but through a genuine incapacity to inhabit the version of herself that fame required. The version fame required was the queen of crime. She was expected to appear at literary lunches and present a face that matched the image, authoritative, warmly English, comfortable with her own celebrity. The actual woman in her mid-60s by the mid-1950s found public events physically exhausting and socially expensive in a way that had only intensified with age. The practiced surface she had maintained through decades of necessary performance was still available to her, but the energy required to deploy it had diminished, and she was increasingly reluctant to spend what remained on appearances that served other people's requirements of her. She was also going deaf. The hearing loss had been gradual through the 1950s and became pronounced enough by the early 1960s to constitute a practical barrier to the kind of social interaction that public appearances required. Conversations in noisy rooms became difficult, then unreliable, then essentially impossible without the careful management of positioning and proximity that large gatherings did not accommodate. She wore hearing aids that she found uncomfortable and that worked imperfectly. At events she did attend, she managed the deficit with the same technique she had deployed in every social situation that exceeded her comfort. Pleasant surface, strategic positioning, the appearance of full engagement maintained through careful observation of the non-auditory cues people provided. Nobody who met her during this period and wrote about it afterward describes noticing anything wrong. This itself is a kind of achievement. Max was knighted in 1968 for his services to archaeology, Sir Max Mallowan, and Agatha became Lady Mallowan, a title she found mildly amusing and used rarely. The knighthood was genuine recognition of Max's scholarly work, the Nimrud excavations, the publications that had established his standing in the field. He deserved it by any reasonable assessment of archaeological contribution. but it arrived in the context of a career that Agatha's income had substantially underwritten for decades, and the public framing of the honor, which was about Max, as it was correctly about Max, contained no acknowledgement of this dimension. She did not expect acknowledgement. She had never organized her contributions around the expectation of acknowledgement, but it was a fact that existed in the structure of their life together, visible to anyone who looked at the finances and the chronology with attention. She received the CBE in 1956 and the DBE, making her Dame Agatha Christie in 1971. The 1971 honor required a formal ceremony, an appearance at the palace, the specific pageantry of state recognition. She went. The photographs from this occasion show a large, white-haired woman of 81 in formal dress, standing with the composed solidity of someone who has decided that the thing will be gotten through, and that getting through it with dignity is what is required. She looks neither pleased nor displeased. She looks present in the way that she had always been present, entirely on the surface, entirely behind it. By 1971, she had not published a new Poirot novel in 3 years, which was unusual enough in her output to be noticed. The previous novel, Halloween Party in 1969, had received reviews that were kind in the specific way that reviews of elderly writers' late work tend to be kind, acknowledging the achievement while noting, with tactful indirection, that the energy was not quite what it had been. Agatha read the reviews. She recognized what they were saying. She had been recognizing it for some years. The 2 final novels, Curtain, which killed Poirot, and Sleeping Murder, which would be Miss Marple's last case, had actually been written during the Second World War in 1940 and 1941. She had placed them in a bank vault with instructions that they be published after her death, one for each detective. This decision, made in wartime when she genuinely did not know whether she would survive the bombing, had a practical origin. But the effect of having written both endings 3 decades before they appeared meant that she had been living since 1941 with the knowledge of exactly how she intended her detectives to conclude, while continuing to write them in their intermediate adventures for a readership that did not know the end was already written. Curtain was published in 1975, the year before her death, at her own decision. She had reconsidered the posthumous instruction and determined that she wanted to see the response to Poirot's death while she was alive to receive it. The novel's appearance generated considerable coverage, obituaries for a fictional character, which is its own phenomenon. And Agatha followed this coverage from Winterbrook with the combination of professional attention and personal distance that had characterized her relationship to her own public reception for 50 years. Poirot died as Poirot had always operated, in complete command of the available evidence, having assembled the solution in advance and arranged its revelation for maximum clarity. He died in full possession of himself. She was 85. Her own possession of herself was becoming, in the way of very old age, intermittent. There were good days and less good days. She moved through Winterbrook and Greenway with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a body that required more management than it once had. She dictated rather than typed. Max was there. Rosalind visited. The letters that arrived from readers, still arriving, in quantities that required a dedicated system to process, were answered by others on her behalf. But occasionally, when a letter reached her directly, and she was having a good day, she answered it herself. Short notes, a few lines, thanking the reader for writing. The handwriting by this point was large and slightly uncertain. It was still legible. Agatha Christie died on January 12, 1976, at Winterbrook House in Wallingford, Oxfordshire. She was 85 years old. The cause was natural, the general diminishment of very old age, the body's gradual withdrawal from its own maintenance. Max was there. Rosalind was there. The death was quiet in the way that deaths in comfortable houses attended by family tend to be quiet, which is not the same as simple. The announcement went out through the press agencies that afternoon. By evening, the obituaries that had been prepared in advance, the standard journalistic practice for figures of sufficient age and eminence, were running in the major British and international papers. They were extensive. They were largely respectful. They noted the sales figures, the translations, the theatrical records, the honors. They noted the mousetrap still running in the West End after 23 years. They noted Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple. They noted the disappearance. Every obituary noted the disappearance. It appeared in every account with the same unresolved quality it had carried for 50 years. A paragraph, sometimes two, that rehearsed the known facts and acknowledged that no full explanation had ever been given. The medical explanation was mentioned. The hoax theory was mentioned. The name Teresa Neal was mentioned. Agatha's refusal to discuss it was mentioned. The obituaries treated the episode with more circumspection than the 1926 coverage had. She was dead now, and the dead are entitled to a retrospective decency that the living are not always extended. But they could not leave it out. It was too constitutive of the public version of who she had been. She was buried at St. Mary's Church in Cholsey, near Wallingford. The grave is simple. The stone gives her name, her dates, and nothing else. There's a verse from Spenser that Rosalind selected. Sleep after toil, port after stormy seas, ease after war, death after life, does greatly please. It is a restful verse. It suggests arrival. Whether Rosalind chose it for what it said or for what it did not say is not something that has been explained. The estate was considerable but complicated in the ways that estates become complicated when the financial decisions of a long life have been made under pressure without full information, by someone whose primary skill was narrative rather than financial structure. Agatha Christie Limited, the company into which the rights to her work had been transferred decades earlier, was now the primary vehicle for a commercial property of enormous value, one of the most valuable literary estates in the world. The Christie family retained significant interest through Rosalind and her son Matthew Pritchard, to whom Agatha had gifted the rights to The Mousetrap as a birthday present in 1952, a gesture of affection that turned out to be one of the most financially significant gifts in 20th century literary history, since the play ran continuously and generated royalties that accumulated over decades into a sum neither of them could have anticipated in 1952. Rosalind moved immediately and completely into the role of estate controller. She had been preparing for this, in effect, since the years she had spent managing access to Agatha in life. The transition from managing the person to managing the legacy was not a transition in kind, but in scope. The same instincts, the same methods, applied to a larger and more permanent set of materials. She authorized some things, she refused others. She made decisions about adaptations, about biographical projects, about the use of Christie characters in new contexts, with a thoroughness that the literary world found either admirable or impenetrable, depending on the nature of their interest. Max published his autobiography, Mallowin's Memoirs, in 1977. It was a graceful book, scholarly, anecdotal, written with the ease of a man who had spent decades producing readable academic prose. It contained a section on Agatha that was warm and measured and gave, if anything, less of the interior of their marriage than even Agatha's own autobiography had given. He described her as the best of companions, patient, practical, and possessed of a comic sensibility that domestic life brought out most fully. He described the dig seasons with evident pleasure. He did not discuss the first marriage, except obliquely. He did not discuss the 11 days. He was knighted. He was a distinguished archaeologist. He had been married to the most read novelist in the world for 45 years. His memoir described a satisfying life organized around work and companionship and the particular rewards of uncovering things that had been buried for millennia. It is a genuinely pleasant book. It reveals, in aggregate, almost nothing about the person its central companion actually was. Max died in 1978, 2 years after Agatha. He had been working on a final archaeological publication. He was in his mid-70s and had been in declining health since Agatha's death, the particular diminishment of a person whose organizing structure has been removed. Whether what diminished him was grief in the full sense, or the loss of the practical arrangements that Agatha had sustained, or simply the momentum of age coinciding with bereavement, is not something the record specifies. Rosalind died in 2004, having controlled the Christie estate for 28 years with the same methodical authority she had brought to everything. She had in that time made decisions that shaped how Agatha Christie's work was presented, adapted, and understood globally. She had refused certain biographical projects and permitted others. She had protected certain portions of the archive from outside access. She had managed the commercial exploitation of the Christie brand, and by the late 20th century it was a brand, with all that implies, while maintaining as far as she could a distinction between the commercial property and the person it had been derived from. Whether she succeeded in this is a question without a clean answer. The commercial property grew continuously. The person behind it remained, as she had always been, at a managed distance from public understanding. The archive held at the Christie family home contains materials that have not been fully examined by independent researchers. Correspondence from certain periods remains restricted. The full record of what Agatha Christie thought about her own life, what she believed had happened at Newland's Corner, what the marriage to Archie had actually cost her, what she made of the 50 years of public misrepresentation she had lived alongside, exists either in those restricted materials or nowhere at all. The Hydropathic Hotel in Harrogate was demolished in the 1980s. The room where Theresa Neal slept is gone. On the morning of December 4th, 1926, a gypsy laborer walking a Surrey road found a car with its headlights still burning. The driver was gone. That image, the empty car, the coat left behind, the lights running down in the frost, deep entered the public imagination and never quite left it. It was reproduced in newspaper archives and documentary footage in the opening paragraphs of profiles written across 5 decades. It became the image through which one of the most widely read writers in human history was most reliably understood. Not the novels, not the 66 detective stories, the 14 short story collections, the theatrical work still running in the West End half a century after she wrote them. Not the 2 marriages, the archaeological seasons in the Syrian desert, the hospital shifts during the Blitz, the daughter raised through circumstances that would have unmade most people, the empty car, the burning headlights. There is something in this that Agatha Christie would have recognized as a structural problem. She spent her career constructing narratives in which the most visible element, the body in the library, the locked room, the apparently inexplicable wound, turned out to be the least informative part of the story. The solution was always elsewhere. It was in the letter written 3 weeks before the crime, the inheritance nobody had mentioned, the relationship whose existence had been carefully managed out of the visible record. The surface was almost never where the meaning was. The disappearance was the surface. What preceded it? The years of accumulated solitude inside a marriage that had ceased to see her. The death of the one person who paid sustained attention to her interior life. The performance of domestic normality in a house where nothing was normal. That was where the event actually lived. She knew this. She never said it directly, because saying it directly was not something she was constitutionally capable of, and because the world that would have received the statement had already decided what the story was. She lived for 50 more years after Newland's Corner. She wrote 60 more books. She watched her work become a global commercial property, and her name become a brand, and her detectives become cultural figures with existences entirely independent of the novels that generated them. She went deaf and aged and was honored and managed the distance between the public version and the private one with a discipline that never fully relaxed. What she actually thought about all of it, the marriage, the disappearance, the 50 years of misrepresentation, the daughter who guarded her image with a thoroughness that was itself a kind of portrait of what the image had cost, is either in the restricted archive or it is gone. She left behind more books than almost any writer in history, and almost no reliable account of what it had been like to be herself. The headlights burned until the battery ran down. By the time Frederick Dorr found the car that morning, they had already gone out.